The man I'd been taught to fear my whole life looked me in the eye and said 5 words that blew my world apart. "I'm your real father, Viola." I stood in his doorway, locked in place, shaking so hard I could feel it in my teeth. For 25 years, my parents had warned me about Theodore Ashford, dangerous, unstable, a monster. But in the quiet of his tidy living room, neat bookshelves, the bite of fresh coffee in the air, I understood something that made my stomach drop. The monster was never across the street. The monster sat at my dinner table every night, back up. You need to know how a 32-year-old woman ends up on a stranger's porch, realizing her entire life was built on a lie. My name is Viola Brennan, or at least that's what I believed. I'm 32 and I'm an accountant at a midsize firm in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. The job is exactly what you're picturing: decent pay, fluorescent lights that make everyone look ill, and a coffee machine that wheezes like it's fighting for its last breath. I've been there 8 years, which in accountant time is basically a sentence with good behavior. I grew up on Maple Ridge Drive in a house that could have been used in a brochure: white fence, green lawn, American dream, curb appeal. My parents, Jose and Constantia Brennan, were respected. My dad sold insurance for 30 years. My mom stayed home, volunteered at church, and showed up to potlucks with casseroles that made people compliment her like it was a sacred duty. From the outside, we were flawless. From the inside, we were a set of rules where I never quite learned what I'd done wrong. I have 2 siblings. Wesley is my older brother, 35, and somehow a professional at failing upward. 6 business ventures, all bankrolled by our parents, all crashing in spectacular fashion. Did anyone ever call him irresponsible? Of course not. Wesley was the golden child. Wesley once totaled my father's car into a mailbox while texting, and my mother blamed the mailbox for being in a bad spot. That mailbox had been there 15 years. Apparently, it chose that exact moment to leap into Wesley's path. Then there's Nadia, my younger sister, 28, who decided finding herself required touring Europe on my parents' dime. She mailed postcards from Barcelona and Florence while I drove our mother to doctor's appointments and picked up our father's prescriptions. And then there was me, the middle child, the useful one. The one who handled everything and got nothing. For years I told myself it was normal. Some families pick a favorite. I wasn't it. I told myself responsibility was its own reward. I told myself a lot of things so I could sleep, but something always felt off. My mother looked at Wesley and Nadia with warmth, pride, softness. When she looked at me, there was a tightness behind her eyes, guarded, wary, almost afraid. I was 7 when Theodore Ashford moved into the house across the street. He seemed harmless, quiet, graying hair, gentle eyes. He kept his yard pristine and didn't bother anyone. But the moment he arrived, my parents sat me down like it was an emergency. They told me Theodore Ashford was dangerous, that he'd done terrible things, that under no circumstances was I to speak to him or go near his house. If he approached me, I was to run home and tell them immediately. My father's voice was iron. My mother's hands shook. I was 7. I believed them. For 25 years, I crossed the street whenever I passed his place. I avoided looking up. I warned friends not to wander near his yard. The monster across the street became part of my childhood lore, like the boogeyman or whatever lived under the bed. Except monsters under beds aren't real. And as it turns out, neither was the story my parents fed me. It started 3 months ago on a Tuesday, because Tuesdays are when I do my parents' grocery shopping. Yes, at 32. My therapist calls it codependency. I call it being the only child who shows up. I arrived at my parents' house with 4 grocery bags, including my father's exact brand of oatmeal and my mother's specific yogurt, as if the wrong dairy product would end civilization. I'm basically an unpaid personal shopper who doesn't even get a thank you. If martyrdom had a loyalty program, I'd have earned a free cruise by now. My mother wasn't in the kitchen, which was unusual. I heard voices upstairs, so I put the groceries away and went up. The sound was coming from my father's office, a room I was never really allowed into as a kid. The door was cracked. I heard my mother first, tight and urgent, and Wesley after her, calm the way he gets when he's being rewarded. They were talking about the house, transferring the deed, making sure everything was in Wesley's name before, and then my mother said, "We need to do it now." Before Viola starts asking questions, I froze in the hallway with a grocery store loyalty card still in my hand and something inside my chest split open. Before Viola starts asking questions? What were they afraid I'd notice? I should have confronted them right there. I didn't. I went back downstairs, finished putting away the groceries, and told my mother I had to leave early for a work meeting. She barely glanced up from her crossword. That night I didn't sleep. I kept hearing her words on a loop, and once I started paying attention, all the little inconsistencies I'd ignored for years came rushing forward. Why I didn't look like Wesley or Nadia. Why my baby photos lived in a separate album hidden in the attic instead of on the mantle with theirs. Why my mother always redirected when I asked about my birth. I'm an accountant. I notice when things don't balance, and suddenly my entire life looked like a ledger full of missing numbers. A week later, I volunteered to help clean the attic. My mother hesitated. I insisted, smiling like the dutiful daughter I'd been trained to perform. I found the photo in an old shoebox buried under 1980s Christmas decorations, a faded Polaroid still clear enough. My mother, young and radiant, standing next to a man, their hands linked. She was looking at him with an expression I had never once seen her give my father, and she was obviously pregnant. The man beside her was Theodore Ashford. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped it. I flipped it over, in my mother's handwriting, 2 words and a date. Our miracle. The date was exactly 9 months before my birthday. I stuffed the photo into my pocket and climbed down. My mother called up, casual as anything, asking if I'd found anything interesting. I smiled and said, "Just old ornaments." That smile, the one that hides everything, I learned it from her. Before we keep going, hit subscribe and drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one. Thank you. I waited 3 days to confront my mother. 3 nights of staring at that Polaroid, trying to force it into some innocent explanation. Maybe it was a cousin, maybe a friend, maybe, but I don't get paid to believe in maybe. I get paid to believe in proof, and that photo was proof. I chose a Sunday afternoon when my father was napping and Wesley wasn't around to manage the narrative. I found my mother in the kitchen doing what she always did, feeding people who didn't appreciate her. For a second, I thought maybe that was our one point of overlap. I set the photo on the counter beside her cutting board. I said nothing, I just watched her face. The color drained from her cheeks so fast I thought she might actually fall. The knife hit the counter with a hard clack. She stared at the photo like it had fangs. When she looked up at me, I saw something I'd never seen in her eyes before. Panic, pure, naked panic. She started explaining, tripping over herself, contradicting herself, swapping stories mid-sentence. Theodore was an old friend. No, a coworker of my father's. No, she didn't remember taking it at all. It must have been a joke, so I asked one question. Is Theodore Ashford my biological father? Panic turned to anger like a switch flipped. Her face hardened into something ugly. She told me I was being ridiculous, digging up dirt that should stay buried, and if I didn't drop it, I'd be cut out of the family completely, cut out as if I'd ever been fully in. I asked about the deed transfer, about why she and my father were quietly moving everything into Wesley's name. Her anger sharpened into fury. She demanded to know if I'd been spying. She called me ungrateful after everything they'd done for me. Everything they'd done for me. I wanted to laugh. What had they done? Kept me fed and housed while pouring attention and money into my siblings, made me feel like a guest in my own home, lied about my identity, but I didn't laugh. I didn't cry either. I picked up the photo and walked out. That night my father called. His voice was colder than I'd ever heard it. He said my mother was very upset. He said I needed to apologize and forget whatever nonsense I'd gotten into my head. He reminded me Theodore Ashford was dangerous, had stalked my mother years ago, and bringing him up was harming her. I asked why, if Theodore had stalked her, they never called the police. We handled it privately, he snapped. I asked why a man who supposedly stalked her would move across the street from her. He hung up. The following weeks were a crash course in family gaslighting. Suddenly, everyone was worried about poor, confused Viola. Wesley called with that soft, fake sympathetic voice he uses when he wants something. He suggested I might be having a breakdown from work stress and maybe I should see someone before I embarrassed myself further. Nadia sent a long text from whatever European city she was in. Lots of talk about how family is family and sometimes we have to let the past go. Easy advice when you're sipping wine in Tuscany on someone else's money. Even my fiancé, Jace, got weird. Jace Edwards, 3 years together, the man I thought I'd marry. One evening he sat me down and said my family was concerned, that I was getting obsessed over something that probably meant nothing. That I was embarrassing everyone with conspiracy theories. Funny detail about Jace, he'd been trying for over a year to get my father to invest in his real estate development company. My father kept saying he'd think about it, and now suddenly Jace was very committed to keeping the Brennans happy. What timing. I looked at him, the man I'd loved, and realized I didn't know him at all, same as my family, same as myself, so I started digging, quietly, carefully. I pulled my birth certificate from county records. It had been amended when I was 2, amended, not issued, amended. The original father's name had been blacked out and replaced with Jose Brennan, who changes a birth certificate 2 years later. Someone hiding something. Then I searched for Theodore Ashford. If he was truly dangerous, there should have been something: arrests, restraining orders, news stories, anything. Instead, I found a retired literature professor from the local community college. 30 years of teaching, retired with honors, volunteered at the public library twice a week, no criminal record. Not even a parking ticket. The only link between Theodore and my family was a police blotter note from 25 years ago. Constantia Brennan filed a harassment complaint against Theodore Ashford. Closed 3 months later due to insufficient evidence. Insufficient evidence. Those words started echoing through everything my parents had ever claimed. I began watching Theodore from my old bedroom window at my parents' house. Every morning he worked in his garden. Every afternoon he collected his mail at the same time. Some evenings he stood on his porch and looked toward my parents' house with an expression I couldn't name. One afternoon, as I helped my mother carry groceries inside, I noticed him watching. Our eyes met, and in that instant I felt a chill slide straight down my spine. He didn't look at me like a neighbor recognizes a neighbor. He looked at me like someone recognizing a person they love. Someone they lost, someone they've waited for. My mother snapped my name sharp as a command. I looked away. When I glanced back, Theodore was gone. The next week, something arrived in my mailbox with no return address. My name was written on the envelope in careful, elegant script. Inside, a DNA testing kit and a single note on plain white paper. The truth is waiting when you're ready. I stared at that sentence until it blurred. The handwriting wasn't my mother's, my father's, Wesley's, or Nadia's, but someone new. Someone wanted me to know. I took the test that night, sealed it, walked 3 blocks to a mailbox so nobody would see me, and sent it off. Then I went home, poured a glass of wine, and waited for my life to either fall apart or finally make sense. The results came back on a Thursday. I know because I'd been checking my email like it was my job every hour for 8 days. I opened the email in my car on my lunch break. I didn't trust myself to read it in the office. If I was going to unravel, I wanted to do it in private like a civilized person. The report was clinical, clear, and brutal. Jose and Constantia Brennan were not my biological parents. I sat in that parking lot for 45 minutes staring at the screen. Part of me had already known, but seeing it in official lab language hit different. It wasn't a fear anymore, it was fact. The test showed something else, a close DNA match to an unknown male relative. Parent-child close. Theodore Ashford wasn't a stalker, he wasn't a myth, he was my father. And he'd lived across the street for 25 years. I almost drove straight to his house, almost, but I stopped. This wasn't just about me finding a father. It was about what had been done to me, what had been stolen from me, and what my parents had built on top of it. If I confronted this, I needed to do it smart. So I turned into a detective in my own life, and accountants are excellent detectives because we're trained to find what doesn't add up. I pulled up Theodore's old faculty page in archived college listings, doctorate in English literature, 2 books on American poetry. Student reviews called him brilliant, kind, patient. Dangerous criminals don't usually get described as patient by 19-year-olds forced to read Walt Whitman at 8:00 a.m. I found the original police report from the harassment complaint. My mother claimed Theodore had followed her, watched her house, tried to contact her by phone and letters. Theodore denied it. The case was dismissed after my mother withdrew the complaint, citing personal reasons. Then I found the thing that made me physically nauseous. Buried in public court filings, Theodore Ashford created a trust in 1993 for a minor child named Viola Ashford. The initial deposit was $50,000, money from his late mother's estate. Over time, he added to it. By the time I turned 18, it should have been over $180,000. Should have, because the trust had been accessed and drained, the guardian who authorized the withdrawals. Constantia Brennan, my mother stole my inheritance, my real inheritance from my real father meant for me. That night I went further. I dug into my parents' finances. I know how to follow money. What I found made the trust theft look like petty cash. They'd been claiming me as a disabled dependent on their taxes for over a decade. They'd been collecting Social Security benefits in my name, benefits I'd never seen. They'd opened credit cards using my Social Security number and racked up debt under my identity. They hadn't only lied about who I was, they'd been using me since childhood. I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by printouts and filings and felt something I hadn't allowed myself in years. Anger, clean, sharp, clarifying. They stole my father, they stole my money, they stole my identity. And they did it while making me feel like the one who didn't belong, no more. I decided to approach Theodore, but not as myself, not as the furious daughter arriving with receipts. I would go as a confused, naive woman with questions. I'd play dumb because my family had underestimated me my entire life and I could use that. If Theodore truly was the monster they claimed, I'd know soon enough. And if he wasn't, then the real monsters were about to learn their invisible middle child was done being invisible. The next Saturday morning, I dressed for innocence. Soft blue sweater, minimal makeup, hair down instead of my usual practical ponytail. I practiced confused and vulnerable in the mirror. It wasn't hard. I'd spent most of my life there. Then I walked across the street. My heart pounded so loud it filled my ears. Every step felt thick, like wading through water. Fear doesn't vanish just because you've done research. His yard was immaculate, roses along the path, a welcome mat that actually said welcome, not exactly a monster's den. I rang the doorbell. Nothing for a beat, then footsteps. The door opened. Theodore Ashford stood there, older than in the Polaroid but unmistakable. Silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, kind eyes. He was wearing a cardigan, for goodness sake. He looked like the host of a public television show about butterflies. He stared at me and I watched recognition hit him in waves, first shock, then grief, then something that looked painfully like hope. He said my name not as a question but as a fact. Viola. Before I could launch into my rehearsed act, he spoke the sentence that brought me to his doorstep. I'm your real father, Viola. And I've been waiting 25 years for you to knock. So much for playing dumb. He ushered me inside, hands trembling. He had to steady himself on the doorframe like his body couldn't quite hold what he was feeling. His living room was exactly what you'd expect from a retired literature professor. Books everywhere, not staged but lived in. Comfortable furniture softened by time. Photos on the mantle of people I didn't know, and one picture half hidden behind the others, a baby photo of me. I recognized it instantly because my mother kept the same one tucked away in that attic album like a secret. Theodore offered tea, then coffee, then water. He was so nervous he could barely finish a sentence. I told him to sit down before he wore a trench in the carpet. He laughed, surprised, grateful, and I realized it might have been the first time in years someone had spoken to him like he was a normal human being instead of a warning story. For 3 hours, he told me everything. He met my mother in a bookstore in 1991. She was 23, working as a secretary, engaged to Jose Brennan. Theodore was 30 and teaching at the college. They reached for the same poetry book at the same moment. That coincidence became coffee, then dinner, then something neither of them planned. Constantia wasn't happy with Jose. Jose was stable. Jose came from money. Jose had family connections and looked good on paper, but she felt nothing. With Theodore, she felt something real. Their relationship lasted 4 months. Then she discovered she was pregnant. Theodore wanted to marry her. He wanted to raise the baby together. He begged her to leave Jose, promised they'd build a life, promised he'd take care of her. Constantia chose differently. Jose had money and connections and a future that impressed people. Theodore was a young professor with student loans and a small apartment. Security beat love. She ended it immediately. She married Jose 3 weeks later before she was showing. She never told Jose the baby wasn't his. When I was born full term, Jose believed the premature story. Nobody questioned the math. After I was born, Theodore tried to be present in whatever way he could. He wrote letters asking for photos, asking to see me. He opened the trust fund in my name, using his inheritance so I'd be taken care of. Constantia responded by filing a harassment complaint. She told police Theodore was stalking her, sending unwanted letters, watching her house. She told Jose. Jose threatened to destroy Theodore's career if he didn't disappear. Theodore was given a choice: fight for parental rights and risk losing his job, his reputation, everything he'd built, or step back and protect whatever stability I had. He stepped back. He stopped writing, he kept his distance, but he couldn't stop caring. 5 years later, when the house across the street went up for sale, Theodore bought it, not to stalk, not to harass, but to be near. To watch me grow up from a place that was close enough to reassure him I was alive, safe, okay. He watched birthdays, first days of school, milestones. He kept a journal. He loved a daughter who'd been trained to fear him. When I asked about the trust fund, his face tightened. He'd listed Constantia as guardian, believing she'd use it for my education and future. Instead, she forged documents, declared me mentally incapacitated, and drained it. When he discovered the theft, he tried to pursue legal action. But the money was gone, spent on Wesley's disasters, Nadia's travels, and my parents' comfortable life. Lawyers told him the fight would cost more than he'd recover, so he did the only thing he could. He waited, then I asked about the anonymous DNA kit. His eyes filled. He admitted it was him. He'd watched for signs for years. When he saw me in the attic through my old bedroom window, saw the way my hands shook as I studied the photo, saw me hide it in my pocket, he knew something had shifted. He'd bought the kit 3 years earlier and kept it in his desk drawer, too afraid to push. When he realized I was searching, he finally sent it. He apologized for not being braver, for birthdays missed, scraped knees he couldn't bandage, victories he couldn't celebrate. I told him he didn't owe me an apology. The villains weren't across the street. They were in the home I'd been told was mine. He showed me proof, boxes of letters he wrote and never sent, birthday cards for every year. Legal correspondence about the trust. The original birth certificate listing Theodore Ashford as my father before Constantia had it amended. I came intending to perform innocence. Instead, I cried for the first time in months, not just sadness but relief and grief and the strange shock of being seen. Theodore held my hand and apologized again. I told him to stop. We have work to do. That day we made a plan, not revenge exactly, justice. He had documentation of the trust theft. I had evidence of identity fraud, tax fraud, and social security scams. Together, we had enough to collapse the house of cards my parents had spent decades building, but we had to be careful. Constantia had manipulated people her entire adult life. She wouldn't go quietly. That night I went back to my parents' house and did something that took every ounce of acting skill I had. I apologized to my mother. I told her I'd been stressed, confused, that my imagination had gotten away from me. I said I was ready to be a good daughter again. Constantia accepted with graceful condescension. Of course she forgave me. Of course she understood my difficult time. She even hugged me, this woman who stole my father, my money, my identity. I hugged her back and smiled because while she congratulated herself for snapping her wayward daughter into line, I was mentally mapping out every file cabinet I needed to photograph. Over the next month I became the perfect daughter. Groceries, dinners, laughing at my father's jokes, complimenting my mother's cooking. Even reconciling with Jace so he could believe I'd come to my senses. Meanwhile, I met Theodore every week. I photographed documents when my parents weren't looking. I built a case piece by piece. 2 weeks before we planned to move, I found the folder, my mother's filing cabinet, tucked behind old tax returns and utility bills. Label, VA Settlement, VA Viola Ashford, my real name. The name on my original birth certificate, the name I should have grown up with. Inside was everything: trust documents, Theodore's letters, the ones Constantia swore never existed, legal papers showing she'd declared me mentally incompetent, bank statements tracking where the money went. And at the bottom, a letter from Theodore to Constantia dated 15 years ago. He begged to see me once, just once. He promised he'd disappear forever afterward if she'd let him say goodbye. Constantia's response was scrawled in the margin in her handwriting: "Never, she's mine now, you'll never get her back." I photographed every page. Then I put the folder back exactly as I'd found it. From the kitchen, my mother called, asking if I wanted to stay for dinner. Yes, I said, of course. I'd love to. After all, it would be one of the last family dinners we'd ever have. If you're still with me, thank you for listening. And if you're enjoying this, a quick like really helps more than you'd think. It helps other people find these stories too. Okay, here's what happened next. 3 weeks before the party, the invitations went out. Jose and Constantia Brennan's 32nd wedding anniversary celebration. Friends and family welcome, catered dinner, live music. Speeches from the children. My mother was thrilled when I suggested it. She'd always wanted a big anniversary party, one where everyone could witness how perfect her life was, the successful husband, the devoted children, the blessing she'd earned. I told her I wanted to plan everything as a gift, a way to make up for my recent behavior. She accepted with tears in her eyes, genuinely moved by my apparent devotion. If I hadn't been so furious, I might have admired her ability to believe her own performance. Planning took 3 weeks: caterers, musicians, rentals, seating charts. I sent invitations to every person who mattered in my parents' social circle: neighbors, church friends, my father's former colleagues, my mother's book club. Relatives who'd watched me grow up believing I was simply the difficult middle child. Theodore and I met nearly every evening during those weeks, refining the strategy. He hired a forensic accountant to document the trust theft. I organized the evidence of identity fraud and social security scams. We could press charges, but I wanted more than charges. Constantia had built her life on reputation. I wanted that reputation shattered so no one could pretend they never knew. Theodore tried to dissuade me from making it public. He said the legal system would handle it. He said humiliation wasn't worth turning myself into someone I was. I reminded him he'd watched his daughter grow up through glass for 25 years because of what she did. I reminded him she'd stolen his mother's inheritance, money meant for a grandchild Alina never got to meet. He didn't argue after that. The night of the party, I arrived early to oversee setup. The backyard looked perfect: white tents, string lights, flowers everywhere. My mother insisted on blush pink and gold, her original wedding colors, because everything in her world had to match the story she sold. At one point, I caught myself adjusting centerpieces for symmetry and actually laughed. Here I was orchestrating the biggest family takedown Maple Ridge Drive had ever seen, and I still couldn't stop being the responsible one. Old habits don't die fast. Guests began arriving at 6. By 7, the yard was packed, 50 people, maybe more, dressed like they were attending a celebration of marital bliss. Wesley arrived with his wife, Sandra, a quiet woman who always looked slightly terrified. I'd barely spoken to her over the years, but I suspected she understood our family better than she admitted. She avoided my mother the way you avoid a rattlesnake you've spotted in the grass. Smart woman, Nadia flew in from Portugal to my mother's delight. She didn't know I'd paid for her flight. I just told her there was something she needed to see. And then there was Jace, handsome in a new suit, already deep in conversation with Wesley about opportunities. He'd been extra attentive lately, probably sensing he was finally close to my father's investment money. I watched him laugh with my brother, two men bonding over my family's finances, and felt nothing. Whatever love I'd had for Jace Edwards had cooled into something hard and empty, like a column of numbers that will never reconcile. At 8, dinner was served. At 9, the speeches began. Wesley went first with a toast so generic it could have been printed inside a greeting card. He praised Jose and Constantia as supportive, loving parents who built a home overflowing with care. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. I wondered if she remembered what love looked like when it wasn't a weapon. Nadia spoke next, short, sweet, grateful. She thanked our parents for making her adventures possible. She still didn't know whose money paid for those adventures. She would. Then it was my turn. I walked up to the small stage, microphone in hand. My heart hammered, but my hands were steady. 50 faces looked up, expecting the same kind of sentimental praise. I smiled at my mother. She smiled back, already prepared to receive my worship. I thanked everyone for coming. I talked about family, how important it is to know where you come from, to know the truth about your people, how truth matters even when it's uncomfortable. I saw my mother's smile twitch. My father shifted in his chair. Then I said I had a special gift, a video montage of my parents' family journey. I nodded to the tech guy to play it on the large screen. The first image filled the screen, the Polaroid, Constantia pregnant, holding hands with Theodore Ashford. The timestamp visible in the corner. Murmurs rippled immediately. Then the documents appeared, the original birth certificate listing Theodore Ashford as my father, the amended certificate with Jose's name. Legal papers showing my mother declared me mentally incompetent so she could access a trust I didn't know existed. My mother stood up. Her face went chalk white. She was saying something, but she wasn't on the microphone. All anyone could see was a woman who looked like she might collapse. Over the slideshow, I narrated. I explained the trust fund, how it should have held over $180,000 and how it was drained by the woman assigned to protect it. I explained the identity theft, the Social Security fraud, the tax manipulation, the debt in my name. I explained Theodore Ashford, the monster across the street, was actually my father, kept from his daughter by lies and threats and legal manipulation. Then I played the audio recording. I'd made it 3 days earlier, a small microphone tucked in my purse during one of my helpful daughter visits. My mother's voice clear as glass, laughing about how easy it was to drain Theodore's trust. My father joking that the idiot had basically funded their retirement. Wesley calmly explaining how he forged the paperwork to make it all look legitimate. The backyard went silent, not awkward silent, not polite silent, dead silent. My mother cried then, not delicate sympathy tears, ugly, frantic tears, the kind that come when you realize the floor is gone. My father stared down at the ground like it might swallow him. Wesley edged toward the gate, calculating escape, and then I delivered my final gift. Red and blue lights flashed at the end of the driveway, 2 police cars right on schedule. Theodore had filed criminal charges the week before with the evidence we'd gathered. Warrants were issued that morning. I stepped off the stage and walked toward the gate, toward the officers entering the yard. Behind me, my mother screamed. My father tried to hush her. I heard Sandra, Wesley's wife, say something that sounded like, "I knew it, I always knew it." I didn't turn around. I'd spent 32 years looking back, trying to earn love, trying to understand the way I was treated. Now I understood. I was done looking back. The arrests happened fast. The officers were calm, prepared, clearly expecting resistance. Constantia fought, of course, insisting Theodore manipulated me, insisting I was unstable, insisting it was all a misunderstanding. The officers didn't care. They had warrants and evidence. Jose Brennan was arrested for fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. Constantia Brennan faced the same, plus additional charges tied to the trust theft. Wesley Brennan, caught at the Garden Gate, was arrested for his role in forging documents. Unconventional party favors this year, handcuffs for some, closure for others. Not what my mother envisioned when she chose blush pink napkins. 50 guests watched the perfect family led away. Church friends horrified, colleagues stunned, neighbors who'd spent decades believing Theodore Ashford was the danger suddenly realizing they'd been wrong about everything. I stood by the rose bushes waiting to feel victorious. I felt exhausted. 32 years of lies does that. Jace appeared beside me, face arranged into concern, eyes doing math. He reached for my hand and started to say something, how sorry he was, how he had no idea how we should talk. I pulled my hand back and actually looked at him. Handsome, charming. Always had the right words, and yet, the man who sided with my family when I needed him, the man who called my search for truth an obsession, the man who wanted my father's money more than my peace. I slid off my engagement ring, 3-carat princess cut, the one he'd spent months paying down because perfection mattered to him. I placed it in his palm and folded his fingers over it. He started to protest, to explain, to negotiate the moment like he negotiated everything. I was already walking away to the front of the house where Theodore waited. He'd watched from a respectful distance, letting me do this on my own. But when I reached him and finally let my body sag against his shoulder, he held me the way a father holds his child. The way he'd wanted to for 25 years. Guests left in a stunned stream, some stopped to speak. My aunt, my mother's sister, apologized for not seeing it. A neighbor admitted they'd always felt something was wrong in how I was treated. The president of my mother's book club said she was sorry. They didn't know because they didn't want to know. It was easier to accept my parents' story than look beneath the surface, but I didn't say that. I nodded, accepted their apologies, and watched them drive away from the wreckage of my family's reputation. Nadia found me about an hour later, after the police had gone and the caterers quietly packed up the untouched anniversary cake. 32 years of marriage and the celebratory cake headed for the trash. There's a metaphor in there, but I didn't have the energy to chase it. Nadia was crying, real crying, the kind I'd never seen from my breezy little sister. She admitted she'd suspected pieces. She'd noticed our parents treated me differently. She'd wondered why I didn't look like them. She'd even found the trust documents once when she was younger, but Constantia caught her and made her swear never to mention them. Nadia was 15, scared, dependent, so she buried it, told herself it wasn't her business, told herself there must be an explanation. And then she ran across an ocean because staying meant facing a truth she wasn't ready to carry. Part of me wanted to be furious, part of me was. But looking at her, mascara streaked, shaking, I saw someone shaped by our parents' lies too, not the way I was, but damaged nonetheless. I told her we had a lot to talk about. I told her I wasn't ready to forgive her yet, but I also told her I wasn't ready to lose her. She hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. And for the first time in my life I thought, maybe I actually have a sister. When the backyard finally emptied, the string lights still twinkled, absurdly festive over a disaster. Theodore and I stood there facing the house where I'd grown up, the house that had never really been mine. He asked softly if I was okay, a simple question with a complicated answer. I will be, I said, eventually, but right now I just want to go home. He blinked, confused. Home where? I smiled, my first real smile in months. Home, I said, across the street. Where I should have been all along. We walked back to his house together, my father and me, the monster and his daughter, and for the first time in 32 years. I wasn't afraid of what waited on the other side of the door. The legal aftermath took 6 months. Depositions, hearings, evidence reviews, paperwork stacked into mountains. And I say that as someone who once audited a restaurant that stored receipts in shoeboxes. This was worse. The criminal case went first. Jose took a plea deal, reduced charges in exchange for cooperation. His lawyer cited age and health, tried to paint him as a man who'd simply followed his wife's lead for 32 years. The judge wasn't fully convinced but accepted the plea. Jose got 3 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and forfeiture of his pension. Constantia didn't plead. Constantia fought like a cornered animal. She hired expensive attorneys, filed motion after motion, and tried to frame me as an ungrateful daughter manipulated by a predatory older man. The jury didn't buy it. They deliberated less than 4 hours. Constantia Brennan was convicted on 12 counts: fraud, theft, identity theft. At sentencing, she finally showed something that looked like regret, not for what she did, for getting caught. Then it vanished, replaced by the familiar hardness. As officers led her away, she looked at me like she wanted me to believe this wasn't over. But it was over for her. For me, it was the beginning. Wesley's case was separate. His lawyer argued he'd been coerced by our mother. The jury was more receptive than I wanted. Wesley received 18 months in prison and 3 years probation. He lost his business license and he lost his shine. For Wesley, that was the real punishment. Sandra filed for divorce before his sentencing. We met for coffee once. Turns out we had plenty in common. Survivors recognize each other. Then came the civil case. Theodore's attorneys documented every stolen dollar, every forged signature, every lie. The judgment totaled $340,000, the trust principal plus interest and damages. My parents didn't have that in cash. They'd spent it: Wesley's collapses, Nadia's flights, their own comfort. But they did have the Maple Ridge Drive house, the one they'd tried to transfer into Wesley's name to shield it. The court ruled the transfer fraudulent. The house was seized and sold at auction. After fees and costs, I received $280,000, not all of it, but enough. I paid off my student loans, the ones I'd taken because my parents claimed they couldn't help while quietly draining my trust. I set up an emergency fund and I put the rest toward a down payment on a small house, 3 bedrooms, a good yard right next door to Theodore Ashford. My real estate agent thought I was out of my mind. Why would a young woman choose to live beside an elderly professor? I didn't explain. Some things don't fit in closing paperwork. I quit my job at the firm. 8 years under fluorescent lights was enough. I started my own bookkeeping business, small businesses, independent contractors, people who needed their finances untangled. It wasn't glamorous, it was mine. Theodore and I had dinner every Sunday. He cooked his mother's recipes, the ones Alina never got to teach me. I brought dessert from the Italian bakery downtown. We talked about books, history, and all the years that were stolen. He showed me photos of my grandmother, Alina, who died when I was 5. She knew about me. She wanted to meet me. Constantia refused all contact and Alina died without ever holding her grandchild. I keep one of her photos on my nightstand now. Some nights when sleep won't come, I talk to it. I don't know if she can hear me, it still helps. Nadia and I are rebuilding slowly. She moved back from Europe and started working as a translator for a nonprofit she visits monthly. We don't talk much about our parents, it's still too raw, but we talk about sister things, future things. She's the only Brennan I kept. Jace tried to reach out a few times, texts, emails, even a handwritten letter I threw away unopened. Eventually he stopped. Last I heard, he was engaged to someone else. Good luck to her. The neighbors now think Theodore and I are quite the duo, retired professor and accountant, living side by side, having Sunday dinners on the porch. I overheard one of them whispering that we must be eccentric intellectuals. Yes, very dangerous. Watch out for the woman with spreadsheets and the man with poetry books. We might audit your taxes and then argue about Whitman. The Brennan house sold 8 months after the auction. A young couple moved in with 2 kids and a golden retriever. I watched the moving trucks from Theodore's porch and felt something I didn't expect. Peace, not happiness exactly, but peace. About a year after the trial, I found Theodore on his porch with a cardboard box. He looked older that morning, like he'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally decided to set it down. He asked me to sit. I settled into the chair that had become mine, the one with the faded cushion Theodore always meant to replace. I told him not to bother. That cushion had lasted longer than my engagement to Jace, which meant it had earned its spot. Theodore said he had something for me, something he'd held onto for 25 years. Inside the box were birthday cards, 25 of them, one for every year since he moved across the street, each still sealed, my name on the envelope in his careful handwriting. I opened them one by one. My 7th birthday card described me learning to ride a bike, falling 3 times, getting up 3 times. Finally pedaling to the end of the street with my arms raised in triumph. Theodore wrote that he'd celebrated silently from his window. My 16th birthday card mentioned a boy coming to pick me up for what must have been my first date. Theodore wrote that he'd wanted to be the father on the porch, the one making vague but meaningful threats. Instead, he watched from behind curtains. Each card was like that, milestones witnessed at a distance. Graduation, first car, first apartment, 25 years of love with nowhere to put it. The card from my 30th birthday mentioned my engagement to Jace. Theodore wrote that he'd seen the ring when I visited my parents at Christmas. He worried something was wrong because Jace looked at me the way people look at investments. He wrote that he wanted to warn me but couldn't. So he tucked the warning into a card I'd never receive and hoped I'd figure it out myself. Eventually, I did. The last card was different, not sealed, not aged. He'd written it only days earlier. I never stopped believing you'd find your way home. Now that you're here, I need you to know what I've waited your whole life to say. I'm proud of you, not for what you did to them, but for who you became despite them. You're strong and kind and brave. You're everything I hoped you'd be. You are my daughter and I love you. I cried reading it, not the quiet, controlled tears I'd trained myself into over years of forced family dinners, real tears. Messy, unstoppable, the kind that feel like something inside you breaks open and heals at the same time. Theodore held my hand while I cried. He didn't fill the space with words. He didn't need to. When I finally looked up, my eyes drifted to the house across the street, the one I grew up in. The new family had painted the shutters blue, bicycles lay in the lawn. A tire swing hung from the old oak tree, something my parents never allowed because it would ruin the look. The house looked happy now in a way it never did when I lived there. I thought of Constantia in prison, probably writing letters I'll never read. I thought of Jose doing community service somewhere, complaining the whole time. I thought of Wesley rebuilding his story, reshaping the truth into something that made him the victim. They'll move on, people like that always do, but I'm done orbiting them. I spent 32 years measuring myself against their attention, trying to earn approval that was never going to be real. Now I have something better. I'm not alone anymore.